Hi. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Máté, and I'm working here at the CBU as a postdoc with Matt Davis. And in this talk, I would like to kind of present you some preliminary results from a project I started recently. All feedback is very welcome because we are at the beginning of this whole enterprise here. So as Yasha and Rob already illustrated very well, there has been like a big wave of interest and work on using artificial neural networks as models of human cognition or human brain. I mean, lots of papers about that. Most recently, there was one from Adrian Durig et al. Took this figure from there. It's nicely kind of like summarizes what sort of approaches we can take to model cognition and the brain. So you can compare psychology, the behavior, psychophysics. You can compare the brain representations to the model representations using either sort of like representational or based methods or encoding models. You can do some sort of in silico lesion studies or also like developmental. So in this particular study work, in this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on only the behavioral, just like similar to Rob's talk. So we are interested in spoken word recognition, and there are models of spoken word recognition based on artificial neural networks. And of course, the most the kinds of models everybody knows, like in your phone, Siri, Alexa, that sort of stuff, those are really big models, and usually the engineers who are designing them, they are not really interested in any kind of like psychological similarity to human cognition. And just the terms here is like computational adequacy would be like, how well the model can perform the actual task. And the psychological adequacy of the model would be like, how well it can replicate certain aspects of human psychology, the human spoken word recognition. And we're interested in that in particular. So this modeling work goes back decades, back at least to the 80s, where the first connectionist models emerged. Just a handful of these, of course, it's not a exhaustive list at all. One important, so these models were designed so that they could explain aspects of human psychology, human word recognition. So of course, psychological adequacy is really was the prominent design feature here. At the time, of course, such nice and actually amazing computational power was not available at all. So these models had to start with some sort of abstract representations of speech, usually some sort of phonetic representation or phonetic feature representation. So these artificial neural networks, what we use, they have the advantage that you can start with actual speech, so they can actually take the same speech input as humans, and then they can basically recognize words from there. So what sort of human psychological features we are looking at in spoken word recognition? One of them is lexical competition. I think this is one of the very nice illustrations of that. So in this task, humans were listening to simple sentences like pick up the beaker, and then they were looking at pictures like these. So in the picture, they had the target word, the beaker, there. And there was like a competitor word, which is beetle, starts the same, but ends differently. There was a rhyme word, which is called the speaker. It rhymes. It doesn't start with the same syllables, but it never does rhymes. And there was like an unrelated word, in this case, carriage. And then whilst participants were listening to this sentence, the eye movements were monitored, and basically they assessed where participants look during the presentation of the word beaker. And of course, they repeated this with other words, and then basically what you find is that if you plot the percentage of fixations on these words, you can see that the target and the cohort word, which is beetle here, they first are fixated roughly the same amount, and then as the kind of crucial information dividing between the two words arise, then they sharply increase for the target word, and then the competitor just drops off. There's always some sort of activity for the rhyme word, and then there's not much for the unrelated word. So just to say that this, one of the early connectionist models, trace, very nicely replicates this sort of competition behavior. And basically, we, as I said before, we used an artificial neural network, which was published recently. It was coined as earshot. So this is a simple recurrent neural network. It has speech spectrogram as an input, so the real speech, and it has one layer of recurrent units, which is in this particular case long short-term memory units. This is a bit more advanced kind of recurrent neural network than the simple recurrent neural networks Yasha we were talking about, and then it generates a semantic output for the birds. And as I mentioned before, it has computational adequacy. So of course it can reliably recognize words, but you can already see from this accuracy plot across, so this is kind of like a learning curve. I'm plotting here the accuracy of the model predictions versus the number of 1,000 epochs it was trained on the words. So the red line would be the training set. The green was the one where, so the training set, I should explain, the training set comprised like 1,000 words spoken by 10 speakers. And in each model, the model was trained such that one speaker was completely left out, and the rest of the speakers, the 9 remaining speakers, like roughly 10% of the words were left out as well for testing. So those are the green ones. So speakers were seen by the model, but not the particular words. And then the blue one is when the completely excluded talkers. So you can already see that this model is the trade-off. It doesn't perform state-of-the-art at all. It has some limitations. Chief of them is that this big gap between the training and the testing, so which means that this model probably overfits to the data. And the other glaring thing is that the generalization to an unheard speaker, which is, of course, humans are very good at. Humans are much better at this, so so this is a limitation of this model. The reason they chose this kind of very simple, in the realm of artificial neural networks, very simple architectures, is that this is a bit more easily to kind of like get at with like this representation similarity measures and all kind of stuff. So it's like potentially interpretable model, as opposed to the really big ones which have like multiple of these layers embedded, etc. But this model also exhibits the familiar time course of lexical competition. So we use this model and basically exposed it to word recognition tasks with certain, based on certain well-known human word recognition experiments, and I will go into that in a minute. But before that, just a little bit more, because this is a methods day, just a little bit more about the kind of like architecture. So this is a long short-term memory network. So usually in the previous slide as well, and previously, this is one of the standard notation of how you represent a model which has recurrence, so this kind of like recurring arrow. You can also represent such a model as unfolded, which means that basically for every single time step you have kind of like a copy of this model, and they basically share a common weight. So these are these time steps, x1, 0, 0, 1, etc. So for a simple recurrent neural network like Yasha used, this would look like this. So basically you have, for a current input, you have and the previous time step, those are the two inputs, those go into this kind of layer here, which has a certain hyperbolic tangent. Activation function doesn't really matter here, and then basically this generates an output for that particular time step and feeds forward that that prediction to the next time step. So an LSTM is a bit more complicated, but don't be alarmed. This is not as bad as it looks. So basically, this model, this kind of model has two ongoing states. As you can see, they are feeding forward in time. So one is the cell state. This is kind of like the long-term memory of the model, and then the hidden state, which is kind of like the current output. So what controls this kind of like what we put into the long-term memory and what we kind of erase from it is these kind of gates, and one is the forget gate. This controls what we basically erase from that memory. This is the input gate. This controls what we add to that long-term memory, and then this output gate basically controls what we what's the output for that given time step. And then all these are, of course, learned whilst we are training the model. So nothing is kind of fixed there, only the architecture. And so how this looks in our particular model is that, from like just an example from two example words from the whole series, you have the word, the spectrogram of the word. These are sliced up in 10 milliseconds chunks. So basically, this is a vector of power at a given frequency. Those goes into the LSTM network. It gives you the output. Basically, it predicts a semantic output for each time step. And then the two says the cell state and the hidden state are just going forward in time across. One important thing is that we kind of configure the network such that these states are basically fed through to the next word. So basically, this is a design term. You can choose otherwise, so you can have a new start at every single kind of item. But we chose this specifically because the kind of effects we are looking into kind of like context effects. So this way, the model can capture context effects like speech rate of the spoken word or the speaker of the quote spoken word, right? Okay, so we did a couple of improvements on the model. Tried to improve a little bit on this gap here. So first thing, I already said that the memory now the model memory spans across words. So that's important. We introduced some regularization in the form of dropout. In that case, during training, at every training round, a certain proportion of the weights are basically just like not trained, and then these are always randomly allocated during training. That's called dropout, very standard procedure. Nowadays in neural networks, basically just kind of like you flip a switch. In this was in TensorFlow. So very easily implemented. We also changed the input features from linearly spaced to logarithmically spaced spectrogram, and then we use less input features. Instead of like a 256 channel spectrogram, we use a 64 channel spectrogram. And we also extended the training data, more speakers, more words, and this has been done by the original authors of the model. But then we also augmented basically included two other versions of each word, a slower and a faster version. So we augmented the data set with speech rate differences. And with that, we kind of achieved the goal so that the two kind of lines are closer together. The model overfits less. And it also trains much faster. So as you can see, these are thousands of epochs here. So basically, we ended the training about like 2,000 epochs, whereas they trained it up until 8,000 or something. So this makes training more efficient. And at the same time, we did not sacrifice any of the kind of like core psychological feature here that this competition is still there. So the uniqueness point effects were the first. So basically, in this case, we were looking at uniqueness point effects in humans. If you have two words, captain and captive, the uniqueness point is quite late for them, and then for another word, trombone, it is quite early, because the only word in English, I think, starting with trombone, is trombone. And then human listeners basically recognize these words earlier, the early uniqueness points words, than the late uniqueness points words, and this basically depends on speech rate. And this is data from a seminal paper. You can see that early versus late uniqueness points, there is like a response time benefit, and this disappears as the speech rate goes up. It's not very nice. So there's a bigger difference for slow speech than for fast speech. In humans, actually, there's no difference between them. For the model, this shows the exact same time course, except that even in fast speech, we see an advantage for early spoken words, so early uniqueness points words. Same for like the excluded words. The glaring difference here compared to humans that we have much higher errors. This is a limitation of the model. The other effect we looked at is the speaker change effect. So human listeners recognize very slower and less accurately when speakers are changing. And this is demonstrated by these results from this paper, but there's lots of other experiments showing that. So basically you have like a response time advantage when the words are grouped by speaker instead of they are mixed. For the model, on the other hand, we don't see this difference. So for this particular case, for some reason, the model doesn't really care about whether the words are mixed by speaker or grouped together at the same time. So this is quite interesting. We don't quite understand why is this the case. And basically, the learning curves show this is, once again, a modern performance across that. There are some differences in the early phase, up to 500 epochs, but in that case, when stimuli are grouped, that's even worse. So somehow the model learns quite differently from humans. So the take-home message here is that earshot responds similar to human speech rate changes, but not to speaker changes. And there's this RT advantage for fast speech in humans, but perhaps that sort of result that there's no advantage for fast speech is perhaps some sort of experimental limitation of that study. So we are actually thinking about replicating some of that or doing some follow-up experiments. And then we are investigating further architectural changes which we could do and perhaps explain that lack of speaker change effects. And we are thinking about to investigate how earshot responds to degraded speech. Yeah, there are also like interesting human studies on that, and we have some hypotheses to kind of explore. And that would be all.